Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Can you hear me okay? All the way in the back, can you hear me? Stop talking. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. It's wonderful to have you all here today. My name is John Olmschneider. I'm the University Librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, students of Virginia Commonwealth University, and on behalf of the VCU libraries, I extend the warmest possible welcome to all of you this evening to our 32nd annual Brown-Lyons lecture. Thank you. This is a very special lecture for a couple of reasons. First, before our lecture this evening, we had a ceremony honoring the donation and the intake, if you would, of our Holocaust surviving Sefer Torah, composed in Romania in 1750, and survival and a survivor of the depredations of the Nazis in Romania in 1940. It was a great ceremony. We had a klezmer band lead us through the building. I saw real live grown-ups dancing with the Torah, and we had a wonderful ceremony and reading. It was a great way to open this evening's events. If you want to take a look at the Holocaust surviving Torah, you can see it over on the side after the program. It's in the display case and unrolled to where we read it earlier. Please feel free to do that at the end of the program. This is also a special lecture for us because after over a decade of leading us through amazing intellectual and spiritual journeys year after year, Dr. Jack Spiro, hung up the mantle of the Brown-Lyons lecture last year. Everyone gets to retire, even Dr. Spiro, and as sad as I have been about the change, I am delighted by tonight's program and by the continuation of the Brown-Lyons lecture, which will forever benefit from the sound foundation that was created by Dr. Spiro's legacy of wisdom and insight. Tonight's talk also sets us on a new path for the lecture series in the future. I look forward with a great deal of excitement to working with my colleagues here at VCU to bring nationally prominent speakers on issues related to Judaism and Jewish culture to VCU for many springs, many marches to come. As always with the Brown-Lyons lecture, tonight's event is really a community event. Our co-sponsors here tonight include the VCU libraries, the VCU Friends of the Library, and the Center for Judaic Studies at VCU. A deeply appreciative thank you, as always, goes to Jacob and Selma Brown and to the late Dr. Harry Lyons, whose financial contributions have sustained this lecture for many, many years now. And also to the Richmond Jewish Foundation, whose stewardship of the Brown Endowment has been instrumental in making this lecture possible. We're also grateful. We have some folks here from the Hermitage at Cedarfield. They had bus bring them here tonight, and we're grateful to have you with us. Last but certainly not least, we extend our thanks to the VCU Friends of the Library, represented here tonight by a number of members of our board. Their sustained support of VCU and its libraries have made all the difference in advancing the excellence of VCU, the excellence of the experience of our faculty and students, the building you see around us, and so much more in the programming that we do. I hope you will take a moment to look at the brochure that was on your chair and to consider joining the Friends and extend your energies and your financial support to VCU and VCU's wonderful libraries. Remember that your contributions and your involvement truly touch every student here at VCU, because while each student becomes a graduate of one of our schools or the college, every student is a graduate of our library. So join me, please, in a round of applause and appreciation for our friends and all of our sponsors and for our financial supporters for this. Thank you so much. We'll have a reception following tonight's lecture out in the lot. Well, actually in the back. We have lots of food back there for you all. So I hope you'll join us for light refreshments and good conversations with our speakers and with one another, and a chance to talk with Dr. Davis about the topic of the lecture tonight. It's now my honor and great pleasure to introduce Dr. David Weinfeld, who is visiting assistant professor of Judaic Studies here at VCU, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Weinfeld joined us at VCU just this past fall. He's brand new to our VCU community from the University of Toronto, the frozen north, where he came down the south. And to say that he's hit the ground running is a gross understatement. It's been wonderful working with Dr. Weinfeld. He holds the AB from Harvard University and a PhD from New York University, and he has previously taught at Queens College in New York and at Temple University. His particular focus appropriate for tonight, is American Jewish history, especially intellectual history and black-Jewish relations. His book project, which is based on his dissertation, is called An American Friendship, Horace Kallen, Elaine Locke, and the Development of Cultural Pluralism. So thank you, David, for bringing Marni to us tonight, and welcome to the podium to introduce her.
Thank you all so much for coming out here tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited for this. I'm really excited to be here in Richmond and to be at VCU. Like John said, I just moved here in August. It was very humid. I was a little taken aback, but I have recuperated, and I'm actually really loving it here. And I have to say, being in Richmond is a blessing as a professor of Jewish history, because Richmond just has such a long and deep and established and complicated Jewish history. And I've had the opportunity already to explore some of Richmond's Jewish history, looking at documents in archives around the city. And I've had a wonderful chance already teaching VCU's terrific students who are incredibly diverse. VCU is, as many of you probably know, the most diverse university in the state of Virginia. It is the university that has the most students on Pell Grants in the state of Virginia. It is a great place to teach. I really feel honored to do it, and I feel honored to teach Jewish history and Jewish studies and Jewish religion here, and to share those things as widely as possible. And I think we saw a bit of that in the ceremony before with the Torah scroll, and I hope tonight that we're going to have a chance to learn about a really fascinating time and topic in Jewish history, an American Jewish history, that I think is going to be meaningful to all of us and actually quite resonant for our times today. So it's actually my honor, and I am so thrilled to introduce our speaker for the Brown-Lyons lecture tonight. Marni Davis is the Associate Professor of History at Georgia State University in Atlanta. She's the author of this fantastic book, Jews and Booze, Becoming American in the Age of Prohibition. I know that's a topic that is, I think, of great interest to all of us, and I can't wait to hear more about it. So without further ado, Professor Marni Davis.
Hello. This podium makes me look as short as I am. Can you all see and hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, David, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me here. And thanks to the long list of organizations at VCU and at the library and all of the local Jewish cultural organizations. I'm always amazed. It takes a village to do these sorts of speaker series, and I'm deeply flattered to be invited to and thrilled to come and speak to people about my research and to feel like it is interesting to people. I feel very lucky, to be quite honest, to have alighted on this particular topic, and not only because it rhymes, though that has certainly worked to my benefit in a lot of ways, but it's more than just that. It's kind of funny. It's also, I think, in important ways, kind of counterintuitive, the idea of Jews and booze. Because I think for most people, and I actually already had a conversation about this earlier this evening, for most people, the history of the relationship between American Jews and alcohol, or Jews and alcohol in general, is seen through the lens of alcohol consumption. And the general assessment and assumption is that Jews don't really drink very much or don't drink at all. Jews are regarded as an abstemious people. My sense is that historically that's not necessarily true, and I think that there is maybe in our context, there's a generational issue, that maybe that might have been more true in the early 20th century. If there are some undergraduates who are here this evening who, during the Q&A, would like to offer maybe their own experiences, we could talk about that. But I do think that assimilation into a culture, and a culture that drinks as American culture has and does, it plays a role. But considering that more often than not, people think about Jews and booze as a question of whether Jews drink or not, it means that I don't really think about sort of the socioeconomic history of Jews and alcohol. And what I found in my research is that Jews were indeed robustly engaged in the American alcohol trade, particularly in the years between the Civil War and the Great Depression, and through the Prohibition era. But it's more than that. It's not just a history of Jewish entrepreneurship. It's that, but as well, Jewish alcohol entrepreneurship and Jews' relationship to alcohol as both something that they consumed and something that they sold figured prominently in discourses about American Jewish identity over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So first, I'll start by asking the general question, posing the general question, why would American Jews have been involved in the alcohol industry? And I think that the answer is always, when we're talking about why immigrants did what they did, the answer is always a little bit of culture and a little bit of context. It's a little bit of what immigrants bring with them when they leave their home countries and move to a new place. And it's a little bit about what kind of environment they find themselves in when they arrive. Now, Jews would have been familiar with the alcohol industry dating back to before their immigration to the United States, particularly you're talking about European Jews, for reasons that date back millennia. Really, you can go back to the establishment of rabbinic law and the requirement, according to kashrut, that Jews have access to kosher wine for their sacramental purposes, for worship. And in order for wine to be kosher, it cannot be touched by somebody who is not halachic, who is not themselves keeping religious law, keeping Jewish law. So that means that from the picking of the grape to the pouring of the wine into the cup, it can only be kosher-keeping Jews who are involved in its production and its distribution. So because of that, Jews gained familiarity with wine production. And in the process, they gained familiarity with lots of different modes and sectors of alcohol production. And not just in Europe, but also we see Jews selling wine, making beer, distilling liquor in the Islamic world, in medieval Islam, but certainly if you look at places like Central and Eastern Europe, Jews were very much involved in the making and selling of alcohol. So they brought that familiarity with, and maybe, some of them brought their own experience or their own family's experience, and some of them just brought a sense that this is something that Jews do, something that Jews can do with them when they immigrated to the United States. So that's the culture that they brought with them. The context was that the United States was a heavy drinking culture from the colonial period and into the early republic. People who came from Europe to the new nation of the United States, who traveled around, were shocked at how much Americans drank and how they fed their children alcohol, and the fact that they drank alcohol with breakfast, and not just light beer or wines, but distilled liquors that they would drink all day. And so there was a robust industry to produce the alcohol that Americans clearly wanted. So the alcohol trade in the United States was dynamic, it was growing, and so when Jews arrived, this was an industry that they could get involved in. And so they were certainly not alone in this. Jews joined millions of Americans, both native-born and immigrant, in establishing themselves and growing the American alcohol trade. Now, I focused my research on American Jews as opposed to other immigrant groups or native born. And what I found when I was sort of looking in different communities and figuring out, how many Jews were in the alcohol industry or how many alcohol entrepreneurs were Jewish in any particular place, what I found was that nowhere were they in the majority. They were always a minority of alcohol entrepreneurs, but in many places, and particularly in places that were central to the national alcohol trade as distribution centers or as production centers, they were a visible cluster way out of proportion, much higher proportion than how much they were of the local population, for instance, in a city like Louisville, Kentucky, or Cincinnati, Ohio, or Peoria, Illinois. These were all whiskey distribution centers. And in each of these cities, I found that though Jews were anywhere between 2 and 5% of the local population, they were between 20 and 25% of local whiskey dealers. Yeah, there we go. And so I have a couple of pictures here to show the range of sectors of the alcohol industry and also the geographic range. Some of you might recognize. I offered a local example here, and there are other local examples too. But here is Strauss and Gunst and Company, who is a whiskey distiller and wholesaler here in Richmond. And of course, as many of you, maybe you know or don't, but one of it might actually have been the first tavern that was founded in Richmond, was founded by Jewish immigrants during the colonial period. But we also have brewers, the brewer of Rheingold beer, and Jews were not terribly involved in the American beer industry for reasons that we could talk about if you're interested in the Q&A. But Samuel Liebman and Sons were very prominent beer brewers, and well into the 1950s. And those of you who were kids when Rheingold beer came up with their advertising campaign for the Rheingold girl. Maybe some of you remember that. A&M Moses in Natchez, Mississippi. If you can see that whiskey, brandy, gin, and wine, selling it from a dry goods store. And also Rabbi Meyer Hirsch, who made sacramental wine during the Prohibition era. We'll talk more about that presently. But in the meantime, though I'm offering this sort of wide range of sectors here, when we're talking about Central European Jews, so sort of the second wave of Jewish immigrants to the United States in the mid-19th century, the vast majority of those Jews who engaged the liquor industry did so selling whiskey. Whiskey distillers and rectifiers and distributors, and as well as selling it retail in stores or in a tavern. And things like that. And that's going to change a little bit when we start talking about Eastern European Jews who were more likely to set up shop in saloons, sort of at the entry level of alcohol entrepreneurship. But we'll talk about them in a moment. So, as we can see here, it's a combination of Jewish culture, that they brought some experience with them and familiarity, and they show up in a culture, in an environment that is eager to find more people who are willing to sell them Kentucky bourbon. And so between the two, many Jewish alcohol entrepreneurs, whiskey entrepreneurs, became very successful. Some of them became central to their religious communities, both locally and nationally. They became some of the most important philanthropists, particularly of Reform Judaism, working with Isaac Mayer Wise, funding some of those Cincinnati and Louisville synagogues and temples and rabbinic organizations. They also became involved in civic politics. Some of them served as mayors or as city aldermen, and also became important philanthropists in municipal and state environments. So this was a source of, or of an avenue for many of them for acculturation, for becoming American, for finding their way in American economy, for finding a way for their sons and their nephews and their sons-in-law to also establish themselves economically. And in that way, American Judaism flourished through the help, in many ways, of these entrepreneurs. So alcohol, it's worth keeping in mind that in this context, though alcohol was a mainstream sector of the economy, an incredibly important sector of the economy, it was actually the 5th largest sector of the American economy in 1900. Today, that position is held by pharmaceuticals. So you can, which, you know, I suppose that there is some balance there. But it gives you some sense of how crucial they were to the flow of the American economy. But at the same time, it was also, can't really say that it's a marginal sector, but you can certainly say that it's one that's looked upon askance. It is legal in the vast majority of the country at this point. It is widespread, but it is also culturally frowned upon by a growing portion of the American population, especially after the Civil War. So before the Civil War, there was a temperance movement, the goal of which was to convince as many Americans to abandon alcohol and often for religious, for Protestant reasons, to embrace abstention from all alcohol consumption. Didn't really work. And when the Civil War ends, for lots of reasons, many Americans, and especially religious Americans and religious Protestants, sort of take stock and look inward and feel that the devastation of the nation is indication of that America, the United States, has fallen from God's grace. And the way to solve this problem is to bring American law closer, as close as possible, to what they believe to be correct moral behavior. And so there is a growing national anti-alcohol movement starting in the 1870s, and this is the era where the National Prohibition Party emerges, where the Women's Christian Temperance Union is formed in 1874, and it's fair to say that the prohibition movement, this modern prohibition movement, the goal of which is not necessarily to use moral suasion, not necessarily to convince people to stop drinking, though that's nice too, but also increasingly to ban alcohol, to make it actually illegal and remove it from the marketplace. The American prohibition movement that emerges in the late 19th century, I think it's fair to say, sort of has two important ideological strains. And these are strains that have been present in American culture since the beginning. They're kind of baked into the American cake. We're still talking about them in a lot of important ways. One is this idea of religiosity, that the effort to ban alcohol was part of an effort to reform American politics in general, according to Protestant theology and morality. But there is also this component of ethnic nationalism, where alcohol is regarded as a nefarious element that has been brought into the country by outsiders. I mean, it is a pretty selective way of looking at who's drinking and who's bringing alcohol into the culture, because it has been part of the culture since the beginning. But according to prohibitionists who develop this anti-immigrant ideology within prohibition politics, there is a belief that immigrants, and as you can see here, there is a guy who's shaped like a barrel, and it says Irish whiskey. And here's another guy shaped like a barrel, and it says lager beer. So he's supposed to be a German immigrant. The other guy's supposed to be an Irish immigrant. And can you guys see what the box that they're carrying between them says? Ballot. So this is the idea that immigrants are bringing their drinking practices with them and corrupting American politics. And behind them are the riots they're bringing disorder and corrupt politics with them. So how did American Jews, who are at this point in the late 19th century very much an immigrant population, or maybe one generation away from the immigrant population, and who are either involved in the alcohol industry or certainly are aware of the role that the alcohol industry and alcohol entrepreneurs play in American Jewish culture. So how did they respond to the Prohibition movement, which was grounded in religious and ethnic nationalism? As I'm sure you can imagine, they didn't like it. Jews, American Jews, saw Prohibition as a direct threat to the non-sectarian state, a direct threat to the very idea that religion or nativity, place of birth, should have no effect on citizenship. They embraced an idea of a civic nation as opposed to an ethnic nation or a religious nation. And they saw the Prohibition movement as potentially undermining this component of American political ideology that gave them opportunities that they hadn't had in the countries that they came from, that were unavailable to them pretty much anywhere else in the world at that point. So they opposed the Prohibition movement, and when they did so from a couple of different angles. One angle from which they opposed the Prohibition movement was one that was in direct conversation with the American Constitution. They invoked a particular vision of American political principles, of constitutional principles that come from the Constitution and Bill of Rights, that defended the right to drink and to participate in alcohol commerce as in accordance with the rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. So when they did things like that, what they're doing is they are presenting themselves as acculturated model Americans, as the kinds of Americans who can talk with knowledge about what they believe is the correct interpretation of the Constitution. And they were not the only anti-prohibitionists in the country, of course. So they have allies who are also immigrants, but also native-born immigrants who are native-born Americans who are opposed to the Prohibition movement, often for reasons of religion or commerce. So as defenders of the Constitution, they can kind of present themselves as model Americans, as truly acculturated Americans. At the same time as they are offering themselves as, we are Americans as much as any other voting citizen. At the same time as they are offering a vision of themselves as sort of universal Americans, they also invoked ideas about Jewish difference, particularly when it comes to issues of alcohol consumption. So here's Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. He was himself a Bavarian immigrant. He came to the United States and worked at a couple different pulpits before he found himself in Cincinnati. And in Cincinnati, he became really the leader of American Reform Judaism and the founder of many of the most important Reform Jewish institutions, rabbinic schools, and organizations that brought all kinds of rabbis together to agree on liturgy and to agree on political issues. He was also the founder of a newspaper called The American Israelite, and where he wrote about both religion, but he wrote about politics, he wrote about international issues, and he wrote about prohibition a lot. And he didn't like it at all. And so one of the articles, I found many articles about prohibition in his newspaper, and one of the articles, and I'm going to quote him directly here, he said, "Temperance men," so people who are opposed to alcohol and want to ban it, "temperance men have often asked the Jews, how it was that there were no drunkards among the Jews, though scarcely any of them abstain entirely from wine, beer, or other fermented liquors." So he's saying, how is it, what's the deal, that Jews drink with some regularity, that it's actually part of their religious tradition and their liturgical practices to drink, the Kaddish of every every Friday and every Saturday and during holidays. And Jews were known to be people who were not complete abstainers from alcohol. And yet, he's saying, Jews were not found among the people who had become so enslaved by alcohol that they became public charges or that they were unable to support their families. And in fact, it seems that does seem to be true. It's kind of hard to tell from some of the records, but it does seem like in hospitals of the late 19th and early 20th century, where you can find records of the reasons that people were hospitalized, that Jews were, of course, hospitalized, but that there is no record of them being hospitalized for a dipsomania or cirrhosis or things like that. So Wise is asking, how come Jews drink, but they don't become enslaved by alcohol? And so he answers his hypothetical question by saying that Judaism creates men who, quote, control their passions and bridle their appetites and have themselves under the control of reason. So he's offering this idea of Jewish identity that is different, saying, yes, we are different. We have different practices. We have a different we have a different sensibility. And yet it's just the sensibility you guys want, because we can consume alcohol, but we do so with rigorous moderation. There are lots of rabbis who spoke in this way during the years of the fight about prohibition and about alcohol. I'll just quote one other rabbi just because it's so concise and pithy and perfect, a rabbi named E.B.M. Brown, also known as Alphabet Brown, who was a bit of a peripatetic rabbi in the country. He spent a little bit of time in Atlanta, and he gave a speech about the Jews and temperance. And from his speech, the quote is, "Yes, the Jew drinks, but he knows when to stop." Again, I am not making any truth claims about whether or not that's true. I am interested, I honestly don't know. I am interested in the use to which that claim is put, both in the 19th century and even up until today. So here's Wise and Brown and other American Jews who are offering American Judaism and the American Jewish population as a corrective to both the drunkards who can't control their alcohol and to the teetotalers who are incapable of understanding that it's possible to control your alcohol, that Jews are moderate and rational, as they're different, and yet they are the kind of Americans that other Americans would want. So it's a kind of a brilliant move that wet politics becomes this opportunity, wet politics meaning the politics of anti-prohibitionism as opposed to dry politics, which is the politics of wanting to remove alcohol from the marketplace. So wet politics were thus an opportunity for American Jews to express their simultaneous commitments to their Jewish identities as different, but also to their American identities as assimilated, as acculturated, to show pride and difference while demonstrating assimilation simultaneously. Now, as American Jews are taking up this claim and making this argument and becoming more engaged in the alcohol industry in the United States, the Prohibition movement was still finding increasing success. And one of the ways that they do this is by directing their critique increasingly away from the problem of alcohol consumption, that the problem isn't the drinker himself or herself, but the problem is production. The problem is the person who sells the alcohol to the victim of this evil industry. And this is especially regarded as a problem at the retail level. This is the era, the late 1890s, when the Anti-Saloon League is formed. And the goal of the Anti-Saloon League is to remove retail concessions where people can buy alcohol, buy the drink, buy the growler, and so on. And this is happening at precisely the moment that Eastern European Jews are entering the alcohol trade. I wanted to make sure that this this is just regarding my last point. I almost forgot the slide. So this is the Bernheim brothers of Louisville, Kentucky, and you can see how, they don't say anywhere on this advertisement that they're selling alcohol, although it is an advertisement for alcohol, but they also have the statue of Thomas Jefferson in between them. They actually funded this statue of Jefferson to be placed in front of the State House in Louisville. And so Bernheim, especially Isaac Wolf Bernheim, was a very enthusiastic assimilationist and wanted to utilize the symbols and the ideals, as he believed them, of American politics in order to support his industry and the identity of American Jews. But, as I said, this is becoming less and less possible, especially as the saloon trade is coming under increasing scrutiny. And this brings us to the Atlanta race riot, which is not an event that's very well known. In Atlanta, people are talking about it now in a way that they really hadn't been for decades, had not been for decades. But I argue that the Atlanta race riot is actually central to the story of national prohibition's success. And this is actually a cover story from a Parisian newspaper. There's a similar cover from an Italian newspaper. So you can see it got international coverage. It was covered all over the U.S., and then it got submerged in history until fairly recently. Now, so to tell the story of this race riot, like many other southern cities, and I don't know, perhaps Richmond has a neighborhood like this too, Atlanta had a mixed race district, and this is a city that is becoming increasingly segregated by race, and where Jim Crow is really establishing itself as part of a sort of a crucial element in municipal law, both residentially and really in every possible way. But there was a mixed race district called Decatur Street. And Decatur Street was a red light district. It was an immigrant neighborhood. It was a poor neighborhood. And it was a place where blacks and whites, people of different classes, men and women would fraternize, would get together, and the alcohol was available, and there was a lot of entertainment available, and there were brothels there. And so, not surprisingly, this neighborhood made many white middle-class Southerners and Atlantans really anxious. It's worth pointing out that in my research I found that at the time of the race riot in 1906, 50%, half of the saloon keepers on Decatur Street were Russian Jewish immigrants. And most of them had only been in the business very briefly. It was something that they had gotten into probably just upon arrival. It was an easy business to start up. It was sort of entry-level capitalism. All you needed was a couple bottles and some place for people to stand around. It was highly unregulated. And so Decatur Street became a locus of concerns about race mixing, especially where alcohol was present. And this is at a time where nationally there is this increasing anxiety of what historians have come to call the myth of the black beast rapist, the idea that African American men were unable to control themselves when they were drunk, and inevitably when they got drunk, what they would do is they would go look for a white woman to attack. And you see this in cities all over the country. It becomes a justification for lynching. It becomes a justification for other forms of segregation and disfranchisement, the removal of African American men from voter rolls in a very official capacity. And so the debates over Decatur Street came to a crescendo in September of 1906 when this riot takes place. The state responds to the riot by making alcohol illegal statewide. So Georgia becomes the first state in the South to ban alcohol entirely. And it's also worth pointing out that it's that same legislative body during that same session that also disenfranchises black men and says that they are unable to vote in elections. So when Georgia goes dry, it's really the first domino that falls. And over the course of the next 5 years, 6 years or so, the rest of the South, with some exceptions, Louisiana being one of them, I think because of their high Catholic population, mostly, that the rest of the South follows. And then other regions start to follow. And so this is a moment where two things happen. It's the moment where the Anti-Saloon League and the prohibitionists realize that victory could potentially be in sight. It is also the moment where Jewish alcohol entrepreneurs start to come under scrutiny. So this is an image that comes from a book called Following the Color Line, by a muckraking journalist named Ray Stannard Baker. This is an era of racial tension and racial violence all throughout the country. And Baker takes himself on tour of the United States. He's writing for American Magazine, the American Magazine, which is a muckraking magazine of the progressive era. And he's going from city to city trying to just explore and communicate about what's going on in race relations. And he starts his tour in Atlanta. And so he's explored what happened in Atlanta, why did the race riot happen, what have been the repercussions of the race riot, how are black people responding, and how are white people responding. And so you can see these pictures. These are two saloons. One you can see on the glass is Cohen and Union, and it's white only. And the other one is A. Abelsky, and it says colored only underneath on the glass. And these are both Russian Jewish immigrants who are, Abelsky is on Decatur Street, Cohen and Union is nearby in the Central Business District. And underneath you can see that it says, showing how the color line was drawn by the saloons in Atlanta, Georgia. Many of the saloons for Negroes were kept by foreigners, usually Jews. Now, it's hard to tell from the rest of the article and what he wrote in general about Jewish immigrants and Jewish communities if he meant this as in an accusatory way. But there are a number of other articles that come out of this era that are reporting on the Atlanta race riot and then that are reporting on the alcohol industry and in the South in general, and the South really becomes one of the focuses here. That the problem here is that Jews are selling alcohol to black men. And in doing so, they are showing that they are unwilling or unable to adhere to American racial norms. That they don't know how to live on the white side of the black-white divide, which is increasingly the most important division line in the country. And this is intertwined with old accusations that certainly predate immigration to the United States that Jews were unscrupulous businessmen who were more interested in their own remuneration than in the health and well-being of their communities. And so this becomes part of the prohibitionist argument. And American Jews begin to change their minds about those who are in the alcohol industry, begin to offer some regrets for having been involved in it at all. And some of that might be cultural. Some of it is obviously economic, because by 1919, the wave of prohibition successes had led to the ratification of the 18th Amendment, which went into law in 1920, in January 1st, 1920. And according to the 18th Amendment, the production, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors were made illegal under most circumstances. Now, the special exceptions here I'll talk about in a second, because they're really important. So as prohibition gained the force of law, Jews' attachment to alcohol still magnified Jewish difference, as Jews had intended only 20 years before, 30 years before. But now that difference had become dangerous. Now that message, now the problem was they had lost control of the message. When it was about consumption, they could tell a story about themselves. Now that the problem has become production, and production is seen as the threat, they had made themselves vulnerable, or they had become vulnerable to accusations of disloyalty. And in fact, much to the dismay and horror of many Americans, Jews did indeed engage in the illegal alcohol trade during Prohibition. These are probably the most famous, among the most famous American Jewish alcohol entrepreneurs, which frustrates me, I have to admit, because they were the splashiest of them, and most flamboyant. But they were also criminals, so we should not think of them as terribly glamorous. Nevertheless, anyone who has watched any episodes of Boardwalk Empire certainly recognizes a couple of these names. Certainly Rothstein and Meyer Lansky. Longy Zwillman was central to the Newark bootlegging syndicate and was one of the people who moved alcohol from the Caribbean up and down the East Coast. The Detroit's Purple Gang, and these were all Jews. Some of them were themselves immigrants. Some of them were first-generation Americans. They mostly came. All of these men, well, actually, with the exception of Rothstein, Rothstein came from a more sort of middle-class background. By the vast majority of bootleggers, Jewish and otherwise, Italian and Irish and native-born as well. The majority of these bootleggers came from the working class and recognized business opportunity when they saw it, really. But Detroit's Purple Gang was particularly violent and were known to being merciless in their willingness to kill people who got in their way. Of course, someone who is not here is Sam Bronfman. Not an American Jew, he was Canadian, but he was also absolutely crucial to the availability of alcohol, of bootlegged alcohol throughout the United States during all of Prohibition. And in fact, he did have connections to American Jewish bootleggers, but he was connected to bootleggers regardless of their ethnic background. But the other problem, which has at this point sort of been submerged, I think, in the story, because maybe it's not so glamorous and it doesn't make for a fun violent HBO miniseries, is that there was a portion of the Volstead Act, and the Volstead Act was the actual law that made the rules of prohibition, that put the rules of prohibition in place. Section 6 of the Volstead Act declared that sacramental wine was legal, that for the purposes of religious ritual, it was possible to access wine, especially sacramental wine, as long as it was produced and made available under particular circumstances. It had to be given a license by the state. Now, there are two problems here with the way that the sacramental wine dispensation worked. The first is that if you think about the difference between, say, how Jews and Catholics consume sacramental wine. For Catholics, doing it, officially, the wine goes from the distribution house to the church. It is consumed in the church, the end. Now, of course, it didn't work like that all the time either, and there were plenty of Catholic sacramental wine distributors who bootlegged it too. But there's a particular problem for Jewish ritual, because Jewish ritual happens at home. And so it was part of the law that every rabbi would distribute at most 10 gallons of wine per Jewish family in their congregation to whoever wanted it. But what happens to the wine once it leaves the distribution center or it leaves the eyes of the rabbi and it ends up in people's homes? There's no oversight. First problem. Second problem is that in the United States in the early 20th century, there's no ecclesiastical hierarchy that ordains rabbis. There is a Reform rabbinic school. There are other rabbinic schools, but the majority of Orthodox rabbis coming to the United States at this time, they worked with a rabbi in their hometowns, and they don't have any like special credentials, and there's no degree that they have on their wall. They have the capacity and the knowledge, but it gets to the point where anyone can say, "Yeah, I'm a rabbi." And that's what happened. I mean, you see rabbis of all kinds of ethnic backgrounds who are handing in lists of their congregants' names. Their last names are like Shaughnessy and O'Malley. And so there's no distribution of consumption. There's no distribution of distribution. And within a few years, actually, like immediately, the distribution of sacramental wine had exploded. Everybody loves this picture. It always gets a huge laugh. I mean, poor guy's just picking up his wine for the Shabbos. And so American Jewish leaders were horrified and mortified. They had hoped, Jewish leaders had actually participated in the creation of Section 6 of the Volstead Act, and they had hoped that in doing so, they would be able to align Jewish practice with American law. And the opposite had happened. That Jewish wine, the rabbinic wine scandals were in papers all over the country. And it was clear that it was specifically Jewish access to sacramental wine that was basically busting a huge hole in this vessel. And so both Jewish bootleggers and rabbinic wine scandals, you know, to use the Yiddish word, it was a shanda. It was humiliating for American Jews, because it seemed as if Jews were exploiting this new law and exploiting the Constitution for their own economic gain, as if they held themselves to different standards of moral and legal conduct. And they feared, and rightly so, they feared that they would be scapegoated for Prohibition's failure. And in fact, Henry Ford wrote at great length about the problem of not just Jewish engagement in the liquor industry before Prohibition, but also the problem of Jewish bootlegging. And the Ku Klux Klan as well regarded American Jewish bootleggers as central to the problem of why Prohibition wasn't working. So Prohibition does eventually end in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. It's the only time that a constitutional amendment had to be fixed with another constitutional amendment. And at the end of Prohibition, the owners of two of the largest distilling corporations were in fact Jewish. One was Sam Bronfman. This is a period in which the industry is becoming increasingly concentrated, and so larger companies are buying up a lot of smaller companies. The other is a man named Louis Rosenstiel out of Cincinnati, who had the foresight to realize that another dispensation for medicinal alcohol might be something that he would be able to utilize. So what Rosenstiel was able to do, thinking that this is clearly going to come to an end, and he wasn't the only one who figured this, but Rosenstiel said, clearly Prohibition's not going to work. At some point, I'm going to want to have access to lots of alcohol. There was gallons and millions of gallons of alcohol sitting in warehouses being sold, sometimes for medicinal alcohol, sometimes just sitting there, and he bought them. And so that meant that when Prohibition ends in 1933 and whiskey distillers say, great, we can start making alcohol again, but it takes years to actually, you have to distill it, and then it has to be aged. But Rosenstiel hits the ground running. He's ready to go because he's already got barrels and barrels ready for distribution. After Prohibition, American Jews were far less likely to be engaged in the American alcohol trade. And I think that's in part because the industry had, in fact, become more concentrated. It was just not a job that was as widely available. But the other thing is that this is the generation of American Jews who are far more likely to enter the professions, to seek white-collar work. They're less likely to be engaged in this kind of entrepreneurship. And so the story, I think, kind of ends there, not entirely, but mostly. Now, today, it seems to me that one of the things that's happening is a reemergence of interest in sort of Jewish-produced alcohol. And I think, it's really different. And I think that part of it, and in case you guys are wondering what we're looking at here, so there's a bottle by Heaven Hill, and this is a very old and established Kentucky bourbon distillery, and owned by a Jewish family today, fairly recent, I think, that they own it. And it's Whiskey Jubilee. which is actually a festival that takes place in New York and Chicago, and I think now Los Angeles every year, where kosher whiskeys and kosher bourbon is brought to these festivals, and people drink it, and I think there's a contest for which is the best kosher bourbon. And the other is Hebrew, which is actually pretty decent beer. It's produced in Brooklyn. And they have a sort of a series. They have one, I think they have an IPA that's named after Lenny Bruce. They have they have a Hanukkah beer that's, I think, called Messiah Ale. And so they're really, they're committed. I mean, there's a lot going on here, that there's this sort of emergence of interest in craft production and sort of the small batchness of everything in this age of foodie gourmet fascination, where, this moment of consumer capitalism where connoisseurship really hangs on small batch things. And I think that under those circumstances, kosherness is really kind of having a moment. But the idea that Jewish identity is once again being tied into alcohol, but in this kind of joyful, kitschy way, I think that there's something really new going on here. It shows that the context matters powerfully, right? That the meaning of alcohol itself and the meaning of Jewishness in the late 20th and early 20th century, that what they mean when they're intertwined has come to change dramatically. But I do think, though, that we see this change, we'd also see some continuity. And the continuity, what has remained constant, is that American Jews are seemingly never-endingly negotiating between maintaining difference and merging into the American mainstream with beer and bourbon, that the desire to be both a part of the people and a people apart remains a constant in American Jewish life. Thank you. I would be very happy to take questions if anyone, there's one right there. Sir.
That was excellent, and as chair in Catholic Studies, now I feel compelled to follow up with something on Catholics and the liquor industry.
I support that entirely.
Anecdotally, we moved to Evanston, suburb of Chicago, in 1979, which you might know is the home of the Christian Women's Temperance Union, and Evanston was still dry when we moved there.
Oh, my goodness.
So if you wanted liquor, you had to go down to Chicago to purchase it.
And I'm sure there was plenty. Then as now.
So my question is, prior to Prohibition, were Jews more concentrated in wine or bourbon and rye?
My sense is that they were concentrated in distilled liquors and primarily in whiskeys. Sometimes they would import, if they were wholesalers and importers, they might import distilled liquors from Europe. But whiskey was a powerfully American, a symbolically powerfully American product. And so I think that also, in addition to the environment that they came into, that was what was selling, and if they were living in the Midwest, that was what was being produced and available for distribution, that there was also something meaningful and useful about selling such an American product. I mean, there's no surprise they weren't selling rum, right? Because by the time they get there, rum is, is regarded as that's from the English colonial tyrants, and whiskey is what sort of the American response. And so I think that's why American Jews got into it. The wine industry was so small in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. Americans really didn't, they regarded wine as sort of, and of course this isn't entirely true, there were Americans who drank wine, but not enough to really create much of an American wine industry. There was one briefly in California, and Jews were involved in it, but then there was an agricultural disease that kind of wiped out the American, all those grapes, those crops, and those who had been planting those grapes then generally replaced it with almonds and citrus. But Americans regarded wine as a little bit too sophisticated, it's snotty, and they preferred different alcohols. The American beer industry was overdeterminedly German. in its ethnic orientation. It was, I mean, in these Midwestern cities that were huge beer-producing cities like St. Louis and Milwaukee, of course, and Newark, New Jersey, and in Brooklyn too. These industries, the brewers, were doing the exact same work that the American distillers and wholesalers, the Jewish distillers and wholesalers, were doing, creating jobs for new immigrants from their same places. And so these were just not necessarily jobs that American Jews got or sought out. For circumstances having to do with lots of different reasons, there's not just one causal factor, but distilled liquors became sort of the center of American Jewish alcohol entrepreneurship. Yes? Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is primarily, well, actually, I was going to say it, but if we're talking about the late 19th century, the philanthropy was, it seems like it had two areas of primary interest, and one of them was American Jewish religion and culture, so the establishment of temples and synagogues and sort of Jewish communal organizations. And the other one is civic life. And it seems like they mostly kept it local. And I don't think that there's anything particularly Jewish about that. I think that in this era, in the Gilded Age, in the late 19th century, that most philanthropists were interested in establishing and growing their own cities, founding hospitals and other kinds of civic organizations, funding the building of an opera house and things like that. But one would be remiss not to mention Bronfman here, because after Prohibition, and Bronfman he's never Sam Bronfman, and I don't know if I think this might be true of his sons too, they have never admitted how involved they were in the alcohol, in bootlegging, during American Prohibition. So I feel like I can't speak to it with any real authority, although it's kind of just everybody knows that it's the case. But after Prohibition, the family really sought legitimacy and got involved in Jewish philanthropy very intensively, and funded the establishment of Jewish educational institutions. Their funding of Israel was very robust. So I'm not sure that there's anything sort of specific about how American Jewish alcohol entrepreneurs engaged philanthropy. It's just that they were so present that it was voluminous in a way that I think tells us a lot about the role that they played in their cultures, both religious and ecumenical. Yes?
Just curiously, since you talked about the prohibition looking at Irish, Germans, and Jews, so I suspect that a lot of Christian Jews were English descendants, English or Scottish descendants?
Primarily that's true. I guess the term that is often used is Anglo-American. Although I think it would be really, for some of them, they could surely, trace their genealogy back to, the earliest of English settlers in the United States. I think that by the time we get to the early 20th century, there's been quite a lot of intermarriage among white Americans of Northern and Western European descent in general, so it would be hard to say that ethnically speaking there is a direct line, but ideologically speaking, absolutely, an idea of Anglo-American political identity that regards its ideological lineage to a very British and then American conception of both, of religion and of constitutional law.
So growing up in the upper Midwest in the 1940s, 50s, 60s,
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sure. So these are kosher wine producers, and another one you didn't mention, and maybe this company didn't really make it that far out of New York, but a company called Shapiro's. Have you ever heard of them? I just remember, I think about them a lot because their advertising slogan was, for some reason, "Wine so thick you could cut it with a knife." And I don't know why that's a good thing, but it seemed to work fine for them. Anyway, so these are the Manischewitz family and other families who sell kosher wine. Some of them actually established themselves well before Prohibition. The Manischewitz family begins their economic life in the United States selling matzah. And then they get involved in the alcohol trade, I think even after Prohibition. There were not a lot of kosher wine producers in the United States before Prohibition. There were some, but the thing was that you can make kosher wine yourself in your own house. And so that does sort of limit the necessity of packaged and distributed commercially produced, mass-produced kosher wine. But after the Second World War, sort of during the era of sort of mass commodification, kosher wine becomes a staple in American Jewish life, and I think that has as much to do with successful advertising campaigns. And it's also it seems like there is a conception that kosher wine has to be unspeakably sweet, that there is something about the relationship between its like cloying sweetness and its sanctity. And that's not true. That has everything to do with the kind of grapes that were used early on, that they were really bad grapes. They were the kinds of grapes that you had to add a lot of sugar in order to make it palatable. And so that becomes our idea of what kosher wine tastes like. And it's another thing that I think is really interesting is that kosher wine companies in the 1950s, they begin to worry that their markets, that they've basically reached market saturation because there are only so many Jews and there's only so many Passovers every year, and how are they going to increase their market share? So they start advertising to African Americans. And they have tremendous success doing this by advertising in black neighborhoods, by making sure that it is distributed, especially by Jewish alcohol retailers who are working in African American neighborhoods. And so you see in the 1950s and 60s, and there's this amazing article in Commentary magazine from, I think, 1965 or 1966 about that the kosher wine market has increased in a way that nobody expected because they're advertising to black drinkers.
Well, thank you, Marni, and please round of applause again.
Thank you all.